Hey everyone, and welcome to another Kanoa Reviews, where we review games both new and old on all platforms. If you like the content that I make, then please subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell so you'll never miss a review when it comes out. Today we are taking a look at the game Sin, released in 1998, though the version that I played is Sin Gold, which was the Steam release that comes with a lot of bug fixes, resolution options, and also the expansion. Though for the review I'll be talking about the main game. Since I've been doing quite a few shooters from the late 90s on the channel, I got a request to take a look at this game as well. Sin came out in the same year that Half-Life and Jurassic Park Tresspasser came out, and on its own did a few things that were pretty unique. Ultimately it flopped, though yet has managed to hold a cult following over the years to come. But playing it now, I do have to say that I appreciate some of its unique things that it tried back then, but overall it hasn't aged all that well, and am in all honesty sometimes a bit surprised why this has such a cult following still. I think nostalgia is one hell of a strong mistress, though maybe not as strong as Alexis Sinclair. Sin follows the story of John Blade, a one-liner spewing badass that is part of the Hard Cops, one of the largest security forces in the city of Freeport. He and his hacker friend JC, who will join you on your journey through your earpiece, need to stop an evil plan by the head of the corporation of Sintek named Alexis Sinclair. As you can see, this character was made pretty much with the slogan in mind that sex sells. Her proportions are made to where it's impossible not to notice her giant tits, and the ironic part of it all is that those two parts of her character model have aged the best, with them even having jiggling animations, which I'm sure was quite a big deal back in the day. And I'm a breast person myself, so you don't hear me complaining, but boy did gamers back in the day have a lot of fantasy, because that face is the vision of nightmares. And even in the CGI cutscenes or 3D artwork where her tits look even bigger, she herself also looks a lot more human than within the game, though maybe the word doll is more applicable. I honestly have to talk about this character a bit, since it's a big part of the advertising campaign of this game back in the day, and I'm sure a reason for at least a small part of buyers to get it. They even nowadays joke that Sin is the game with the quote-unquote sexy woman on the cover. Her dialogue throughout the game is also very sexually suggestive the entire time, and they also mention multiple times throughout how hot she is. But I think in the end, it's also done a bit for laughs, since the whole game is kind of full of pretty brash and sexual humor. On the various notice boards throughout the level, you can read some really weird but sometimes funny notes. One, for example, talking about an orgy that is planned by the scientists at 8 PM. And it made me wonder if people would see this as offensive nowadays, since we still have games with a lot of toilet humor like Borderlands. So what about the gameplay? The game runs on the Quake 2 engine, and looks pretty good in terms of that. The shooting in the game feels alright, though by that time had already been done better by other titles. What it did do, that was very unique though, was a certain armor system with the bad guys, but also yourself. Whenever you would face enemies, their character models were divided up into head, torso, and legs, and they could wear armor on those areas like a helmet or body armor. Depending if they were wearing that or not, it would take more shots than usual to kill that enemy. What's more is that you would also destroy the armor in that area, which you visibly saw, and as a result, that character would not drop armor for that specific area for you to pick up. So if your leg or torso armor was low, you better make those headshots count, as otherwise you will destroy that valuable armor you are looking for. The earlier mentioned visual validation of damage done to the enemies looks quite good, and they even spew out lines like they cannot see or cannot feel their legs depending on where they are hit. It's details like this that get really appreciated and feels ahead of its time. The weapons themselves are your pretty much standard arsenal with pistols, machine guns, shotguns, rocket launchers, and sniper rifles. But they do feel very good to use and get the job done. But one of my biggest issues, and I think the part that has aged the least, are the levels. The opening stage is actually really cool and atmospheric. A bank is being assaulted by a group of thugs and a mob boss named Mancini, who does Sinclair's bidding. You open with a short turret section on a chopper, and the cool thing here is that the game introduces its more open level design from the get-go. You see, one of the appealing aspects back in the day were the open level designs and how choices you made in previous missions could impact the next stage. Depending on what you destroy, for example in the turret section, defines your entrance in the next level, and you could even skip entire levels by completing certain objectives a certain way. Heck, it's even possible to complete levels without completing some main objectives, and as a result, you will face more resistance in the stage that comes next. I think that, in and of itself, is very cool and ambitious, and would definitely be something that was a big deal back in 1998, but the truth is that this mechanic doesn't hold to that much anymore nowadays. The only reason how I noticed it, for example, was by looking up a let's play of the game and noticing that a level appeared after a stage I had completed and never got to experience that. It gives some incentive to come back and replay the game, though I don't think the action is good enough and smooth enough to where it will likely result in a replay. But as I said, the first level, which is the bank, is very good since it's super atmospheric and a lot is going on with the cops assaulting the main entrance while robbers are plunging through the windows and taking hostages left and right. You can interact with a lot of objects in the environment. Again, something that must have been quite a big deal then, and the coolest interaction in my opinion comes in the form of the computer screens. If you want to disable security, like cameras or turrets, you need to interact with computers and actually type in commands manually. You therefore actually feel a bit like a hacker, and is a system later copied by Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. But you can also interact with other objects in the environment, making it all feel a bit more lively. The levels are also objective-based, with main and side objectives, and even some secret areas to find. You can sometimes take multiple routes, and the first few stages are the best example of these. So after you manage to head into the vault of the bank, where Mancini is held up, you follow him and his thugs through a tunnel and sewers only to end up in a construction zone and eventually a subway station. And it's here where it already goes downhill with the levels. In retrospect, some of these levels are actually a bit more detailed than the ones coming later, but after the bright and atmospheric bank, these tunnels, construction zones, and subway stations just feel barren, dark, and ugly. The construction zone is still bright and quite open though, making that another highlight. But level design, it's sometimes an incredible mess with a flow that isn't as well paced like something like Half-Life. It can sometimes even be a bit confusing where you need to go as you revisit all these hallways you've already been in order to search for that one particular vent to access. But the subway station does end with a cool battle against a giant mutant that Mancini had turned into after Sinclair injected him with a strange virus called U4. It's kinda like fighting a tyrant from Resident Evil, and the battle location is somewhat familiar to that of Resident Evil 2, which also came out that same year. And where I thought that the levels after the bank were already a step down, I hadn't seen nothing yet. The next few stages were at a research lab, a waterwork facility, a warehouse, etc. Still, some of these stages do have the open-ended feel to it with multiple routes possible and consequences to your actions on how you approach an objective. But my god, do these levels look and feel boring. I honestly could not believe why the game got all the praise by its fan following. I realize it's difficult for levels and environments to stand the test of time from the late 90s, and I even criticized Half-Life 1 having pretty uninteresting environments once outside of the Black Mesa facility. But with Half-Life, at least the Black Mesa sections are super atmospheric and there's a lot going on. With Sin, that is simply not the case. It's the same boring looking hallways after another, and the same industrial type of level we've seen 100 times over. Since I've revisited so many old school shooters over the past weeks, I've kinda come to learn what makes a shooter enjoyable, and that is variety, whether it comes from weapons, enemy types, or levels, and this game simply has none of that. There are plenty of weapons, but they're nothing special. The enemies are fine, but again, nothing special. Most are just thugs, and later on you get machine gun wielding android looking dudes, and even will fight some zombie type things or more mutants. Oh, and the snipers. The snipers are the absolute worst. You fight them through multiple stages, but they are the worst at the dam level, where they are often in spots where you don't initially see them. And they have the capability of killing you in less than 3 shots. It's really ridiculous. But the levels were all just dark, cold, and barren, giving me no motivation or anticipation on what would come next. At a certain point, you have an underwater section, and the ironic thing is that this level is not the worst level in the game, whereas underwater stages usually are. Once again, you can tackle this in multiple ways, which is cool. You actually fight some fish monsters here that seem quite original, but don't offer much of an interesting fight. You do get a harpoon gun though, and fight divers, which makes this level stand out and is another highlight within the game itself. But then after that, the game takes a weird twist where you get turned into a mutant yourself and need to participate in 3 tests against other monsters before turning back into a human. It feels like a bad Far Cry twist, even though Far Cry didn't come out until much later, and doesn't really add anything. The mutant gameplay is boring and can be very confusing, with the turrets taking you under fire for reasons that don't become obvious until you do some trial and error. There's also a stage on an island where initially you think it could be another vibrant level that could feel like the first bank one, but it feels rushed and almost like the developers ran out of budgets, since it's just the same repetitive environments populated with mutants and guard posts. Once again, there are snipers here that make your life quite miserable and will require you to save a lot. And then there's also a section where you take this hoverbike thingy through the island as the volcano is exploding and the lava is rising. I wasn't sure because the controls for this hoverbike thing are literally the worst vehicle controls I have ever witnessed. I'm not even kidding in that I don't think I've ever have experienced a worse controlling vehicle in any other game. It is the opposite of smooth and steers like sandpaper on a stone pavement. It's absolute trash. Luckily, this section doesn't take very long, unless you do the side objectives. But I decided to skip those in this case, since the vehicle was just such garbage. Then, one of the final levels has you go through Sinclair's estate, which starts out with some nice, expensive looking art, but ends up looking more like an S&M dungeon, and in a way it might have also been the goal to make her somewhat of a dominatrix. In the credits, there's literally a photo of some woman dressed as her dominating some guy, and she even says in the game that she likes obedient men. Could have been a kink of some of the developers, I'm not sure. Anyway, once you are done with this, you arrive at the final stage and then have one more boss battle to go through, which is pretty cool, and it's one of those nice big blokes you always remember from old school shooters from the 90s. This guy, which ironically is the mutated father of Sinclair, is a huge bulking monster with a rotary saw and also shoots rockets and bolts of energy. You have an entire arena to hop around in and plenty of ammo to deal with the beast. It's honestly pretty cool for an end boss, and where many other games drop the ball right at the end, Sin kinda does a good job with a memorable encounter. And then when you are finished, you are greeted with the most sexualized CGI yet that finishes very open-ended. The game itself takes around 5 hours or so to complete, and in all honesty, I was very glad when it was finally over. I had a good time initially, but so many of the levels felt so boring and uninspired. Wolfenstein, which admittedly did come out later, proves that you can have great pacing and gameplay in environments that are dark, grey, and somber. But Sin falls flat on its face, unfortunately, with the real highlight being the first bank level, but never again reaching that same quality. On every front, it's the lesser compared to something like Half-Life, and Sin is a good example of a game that definitely did some things that would have impressed back in the day with its armor system and consequences depending on the completion of the objectives. But it's also a great example of a game that did something new back then which hasn't aged all that well. Half-Life also has not aged well on some fronts, but on a cinematic portrayal and experience, it still delivers with the Black Mesa sections as it feels grand, epic, and like a proper horror survival movie. Sin does none of this, and the toilet humor was ironically the only thing that still got a smile on my face from time to time on the otherwise very still game. I honestly think it's pure nostalgia that holds this game up for fans, and it is a game that doesn't offer anything for people nowadays to go back to, unlike something like Half-Life. Yet, it's not all bad, and there are definitely some highlights to be had though. I can count them on one hand, and in the end, Sin gets a 6.6. I honestly think it's pure nostalgia that holds this game up for fans, and is a game that doesn't offer anything for people nowadays to go back to, unlike something like Half-Life. Yet, it's not all bad, and there are definitely some highlights to be had, though I can count them on one hand, and so in the end, Sin gets a 6.6. Sin actually got a sequel in the form of Sin Episodes Emergence, but that was a huge flop and pretty much only acts like a prologue. Once again, sex was a big part of the advertising for that game, with Sinclair now luckily looking more human than this version, and I will be taking a look at that game as many seem to hate this game more than the original Sin, but to me, it actually looks better since it's made on the Source engine. I'm not sure, but we will see that next time when I douse myself again in this cyberpunk story.